Okay, welcome back. Robert Breaker here, and we are continuing our verse-by-verse Bible study through the book of Acts. And here we are now all the way to chapter 23. I can hardly believe it. We've come all the way to chapter 23. So we've got 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. We've got 6 chapters left. And a lot of this is just reading stuff. It's just historical. There's not too much doctrine left in the book of Acts. Basically just some of the things that Paul is going to as he's being allowed by God to reach more and more Gentiles. Now, I need you to remember what we've gone through already, okay? What we've already seen is the Apostle Paul, our apostle, God's man for today, doing something he shouldn't do. He disobeys God. Paul is a sinner. Let's never forget that. And Paul said, you know, he is the chief of sinners. I think you can remember him saying that. And Paul, in his ministry, much of what Paul did was correct. But we can clearly see through this book, the book of Acts, that there was something that Paul did that was wrong. And the thing that Paul did that was wrong was disobeying God and going to Jerusalem when God said not to do it. Now, we've looked at that already, and we saw that. So that's God saying, look, don't do this, Paul. And what did Paul do? He did it anyway. He went against God's wishes. And this is one of the places, you know, in the Bible where we can say, now, Paul did wrong. Now, as we're going through the book of Acts, I want you to remember what Acts is. Acts is a transitional book. Got to remember that. And much of the book is about the Apostle Paul. Now, as we started the book of Acts, I told you there would be a lot of foreshadowing of what's to come. And there was a lot of foreshadowing. There was a lot of things that were pointing to the future thing that Paul would preach. Now, as we're getting toward the end of the book of Acts, it points backwards to a lot of the things that happened to Paul. So as we're reading the book of Acts, and we're starting here in chapter 18, 19, 20, 21, Paul tells about things that happened early in the book of Acts. So the early book of Acts, through foreshadowing, foreshadows some things. And we've looked at that, foreshadowing. Now, I'm not going to get back into that, but if you'll remember our study, you'll see that. And as we're going through the book of Acts in these later chapters, we'll find out that Paul tells what happened. So Paul tells about what happened earlier. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because this is very important. There were people that will try to go to the later book of Acts and say, now that's for us today. And it's not. It's something that Paul was telling about something that happened before. So, for example, in Acts chapter 19, these people, they got baptized in water and the hands laid on them and they spoke in tongues and all these things. People say, that's way out here in Acts 19, so that's for today. But yet you read that passage and they were Jews. And it was all about the Jews here in the early part of Acts. And so it was all still the message of the kingdom message, and it was still to the Jews. And those people were Jews. So Paul had to deal with them for some reason or another. You know, I've still not perfectly figured this out, but it had to do with that. So Paul, everywhere he goes to the Jew first, and then to the Gentiles. And as we continue in the book of Acts, we find out that eventually the Jews completely have nothing to do with Jesus. And so the church age today, there's more Gentiles getting saved than Jews. So Paul goes to Jerusalem against God's wishes and tries to witness to them, is what we've seen so far. And here in chapter 23, why this is Paul being able to speak to the Jews again and defend himself before them. And we're going to get into this here in a minute. But we looked at last time or the time before the question, why? Why did Paul go to Jerusalem? Why would he do that? And the answer is, who knows? Right? So here's Rome over here, the little, they call it the boot because it looks like a leg. And this right here is Rome. And what we've seen so far is God told him, he said, look, don't go to Jerusalem. Just don't, Paul. It's not right that you should go to Jerusalem. And he said to go to Rome. And Paul says, no, I want to go to Jerusalem. Well, what we're going to find out today, and here's Jerusalem. What we're going to find out today is that Paul, and I think that shows up there on the edge. I'm on the edge over here. But this is Jerusalem. So he goes over here to Jerusalem when God told him not to. And that was his sin. That was the thing that he did wrong. Paul should not have done that. Paul should not have disobeyed God. But why was Paul doing this? And we've read before what Paul did. He goes right into the tabernacle, the temple. Right into the court of the tabernacle where all the Jews are. Why would Paul do that? When Paul is no longer under the law. We've read and looked at, Acts 15, that we're no longer under the law. Why would Paul go to Jerusalem and dress up like a Jew and go into them? And why was he trying so hard to get into the temple? And that's where he was found out. That's where they grabbed him and said, hey, this is the Paul guy, this is the evil guy. And why was he doing that when the preaching of Paul is we're no longer under the law? So why did he try to put himself, if you will, in a way that he looked like he was keeping the law? When Paul preached grace. And what did Paul do? Well, Paul is pretending to be under the Jewish law. But the truth of the matter is, he's preaching that the law points us to Christ. And that we're saved by Christ, not by the keeping of the law. But the Jews misunderstood, and they said, he's against the law, he's against the law. And so they grabbed Paul, and they tried to tell Paul, Paul, we don't want you, you're against us, you're a heretic. We're going to see that today. They actually accuse him of heresy. And so what does Paul do? Paul invokes Roman law. And we're going to see that today as well. And Paul says, look, if I can't get a fair shake with you guys, if I can't get you guys to listen to me and all you want to do is kill me, then I plead to Rome. So I ask this law, protect me, because they want to kill me. So there's so many things going on here in the book of Acts. It's incredible. And we looked at last time in Genesis chapter 22, verse 21, as Paul was talking, it says, and he said unto me, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. And when Paul got to the word Gentiles, well, that's what did it. That's what set the Jews on edge, and they said, we don't want to hear anything else you say because we don't like Gentiles. And the Jews didn't think that they should be mixing with the Gentiles, and Paul's the one preaching that they should be preached to, and the gospel should be given to them. Now, verse 22 in Acts 22:22, look what it says. And they gave him audience unto this word. Which word? Gentiles. So the priest said, we don't believe in Gentiles. You're trying to mix the Roman, the pagan, with our religion, is what they were trying to accuse him of. And he's going, no, all I'm doing is telling you that the law points us to Christ. And so if you want to follow the law was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, you need to understand what the law was written for. The law was written to point us to our Messiah, and you guys have rejected your Messiah. So really, Paul is trying to be a Jew who points the Jews to the Jewish Messiah. And that's why he dressed up like that, and that's why he went in there to try to reach them. And what did they do? Verse 22. And they gave him audience unto this word, and they lifted up their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. They say, kill him! Kill him! Well, isn't that what they said to Jesus? What did they say when Jesus showed up? Well, they didn't want Jesus, so they yelled, crucify him. So here they are yelling, crucify him to Jesus. And here Paul comes along, and they're yelling, kill him. So it's almost like a repeat of what we're seeing happening to Jesus. So always keep that in mind. The Jews just don't reject the Messiah once. The religious leaders rejected John the Baptist. They rejected Jesus. They rejected Peter's message. Well, they rejected Stephen. They stoned Stephen. Then they reject Paul. They do not want to accept that Jesus is the Messiah, although some might have. We already looked at that. Some of the Jews did believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but they would not believe this new message of Paul, which was what? Paul preaching in Acts chapter 13, now we've shown that Paul preached justified by his blood. They did not want to accept that salvation is being justified by faith. That was the message that they said, we can't accept. We don't want to hear this, that you're saved by faith. We want to believe that it's by works of the law. Now, I have a theory. I'm just going to throw it out there, and then we're going to keep going, because this is a short chapter, and I figure I probably won't get a full hour in. We'll see. But I've told you this maybe one time before. But during this time, when the temple was rebuilt, nowhere in the Bible does it say that the Ark of the Covenant was there. We don't find the Ark of the Covenant in the time of Jeremiah when they're led into captivity into Babylon. it's kind of the end of the ark. We don't hear anything more about the Ark of the Covenant. So did the Ark of the Covenant actually exist in the temple? I showed you that in the note of my Bible, at the end of my Bible, it talked about some Roman guy that came into Jerusalem. And he found the tabernacle. And he opened it up and he looked inside and he said there's nothing in there in the Holy of Holies. So this is a Roman witness before Jesus and before all this is taking place, that there wasn't even an ark in the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. So can you imagine? The entire Jewish religion is based upon blood atonement made every year in that ark. But if the ark wasn't there, then the people couldn't be forgiven. That's why Jesus would have had to come to die to forgive them. Because their religion was false. Because they weren't keeping the law and doing the sacrifice that they were supposed to. Now, that's just something that I've read. That's just my thought. So my thought was, I wonder what Paul was thinking to go to Jerusalem and go right into the court. I wonder if what Paul was doing was he was walking right to the Holy of Holies and he was about to open the curtain and say, aha! There is no ark. You guys are liars. And maybe that's when they caught him because he was trying to open it. Now, remember what happened when Jesus died. In the book of Matthew, we're told when Jesus died, the temple veil, the veil was the big, huge curtain that was in front of the ark. All right, let me show you the what do you call it? The tabernacle or the temple is divided like this. And so you've got here this curtain, this veil that covered it up. And it's a veil. And this is where the ark is supposed to be. And people would come into this court, and there was the laver there, and the golden altar, and all this stuff. But the ark was supposed to be in here. Now, there was this place here, and an individual would come and offer a sacrifice. And the sacrifice would be placed upon the brazen altar. I think the brazen altar is the bigger one. The little one here was the prayer altar, if I remember correctly. So here's the brazen altar. And so a man would come in, and this is where he would shed blood, and his sacrifice would be offered. And that was for an individual. An individual. But for a nation, once a year, the law said that they were to bring the blood and place it on the ark. And that would be the blood atonement for the entire nation. And so the nation would be saved. Well, so before Jesus came, in the Old Testament, and during the time of Jesus, if a guy was a sinner, he would come up here to the tabernacle. He would come up to the temple, or we'll just call it the tabernacle. And he would say, priest, I've sinned, here's my sacrifice. And they would take the animal, and they would, what was it? Probably a sheep. It could have been a cow. And they would have cut the throat, and the blood would have poured out of that animal. And the Bible says that a priest was to take that blood here, put it into the cup, and then he was to pour it on the altar. And so that made an atonement for his sins. So individuals could get their sins forgiven before Jesus died by individually coming. But was the Ark of the Covenant really there? When Jesus died on the cross, the veil was cut. It was broken from the top down, and it was opened. And people could see in. And I bet the priest had to hide that. Oh, don't let him look in there. Don't let him. Because the only person that was ever allowed in there to see that was the high priest. So only the high priest would know if there was an ark or not. So my theory was the ark's not there. There's a guy named Ron Wyatt who claims to have found the ark buried in Jeremiah's grotto, and it was buried in a cave. And that's a possibility. I'm not sure. So I'm not saying this 100%. You got to believe that there was no ark. But I'm saying I wonder. And I wonder if Paul didn't realize that. And if Paul didn't know that. And the reason that Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem was to march right into the tabernacle, because he was here. He went into this area. And I wonder if he wasn't working his way over here just to poke his head in and say, I knew it. You guys didn't even have the ark to begin with. You claim that you're following the law and offering the sacrifice once a year for the people. And you're fakers. You're liars. You don't even have the ark. You don't even have the thing to offer the blood on for forgiveness. And I think he was going to rip that curtain open and then say, now that's the blood. And I think that might have been in the back of his mind. Now, I'm not sure. I can't prove that. All I can say is there are historical records of Romans that went into Rome, into Jerusalem, and they claim to have gone into the tabernacle, I can't remember, was it 100 years, 200 years before Jesus, and look into the Holy of Holies, and they said it was empty. And if you remember your Old Testament, there was a guy named Doeg, however you may pronounce him, and he went into the Holy of Holies, and God killed him. That was way, way back in the Old Testament. So why didn't this Roman guy die? Okay, so you've got to wonder about these things. You've got to wonder. Now, with that stated, that would be why Jesus was so upset with the Pharisees. You see, we today are in a day and age of apostasy. And I've told you that before, that in the last days there'll be a time of apostasy. I am what you call a dispensationalist. I believe in dispensations. And every dispensation ends in apostasy, and then Jesus has to start something new. So over here in Jesus' day, it was a time of apostasy. The Jews had sunk into apostasy, and the Jewish religious leaders were not following the law. Matter of fact, Jesus rebukes them and says, you hypocrites, you liars, you deceivers. So we see apostasy in Jesus' day and the need to start the New Testament. And so we see the Bible says in the end of the church age there'll be apostasy. That's the need for the rapture, to start a new time, God going back to dealing with the Jews. So I took 16 minutes to explain that, but I wanted to throw that out there, remind you what we're talking about, and how early book of Acts points to Paul and the message of justification by faith and the blood atonement. You know, we saw Philip and how old Philip was preaching, and we have the foreshadowing of Jesus as the Lamb of God and things like that. And then as we're reading the later book of Acts, it's pointing back to things that happened in the life of Paul. So the book of Acts is a transitional book, a lot of foreshadowing, and it all points to the blood atonement of Christ as the way of salvation. That's what Paul says in Romans 3:25, that we're saved by faith in the blood. All right, so now to chapter 23. Remember what happened last time? He ends up in Jerusalem. He gets captured. He speaks to them. And what do they say? Well, they say in verse 30, on the morrow, because he would have known the certainty whereof he would accuse the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set them before them. So this is later, after Paul has already spoke, and after he said the word Gentiles, and the Jews went all angry. This Roman that captured Paul said, look, you come with me, and we're all going to sit down together and figure out what this is about. Because remember, the Roman soldier didn't speak Hebrew. All he's seeing is people fighting each other and yelling at each other in another language. And he's like, I don't know what this is about. So this is Paul, again, standing before the Jews, giving an account. So in verse 1 it says, and Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. So Paul says, look, I have a good conscience. Now, conscience is an interesting word. The word conscience is a word, conscience. Con is Spanish for with. So with, and what is science? Well, it's knowledge. It's supposed to be. So with knowledge. So Paul says, with the knowledge that I was given by God, I've done what I knew was the right thing to do. Remember what Paul said he did? When he was still under the law, he actually killed Christians, thinking that that was the right thing to do because he still believed that the law was right. So even as a lost man going around killing Christians, he did it in good conscience. He was thinking, well, this is the right thing because we're God's people and the law is given by God and these people are against the law, so I'm going to kill them. And he did. And remember last time he told the Pharisees too, hey, you remember when we killed that guy? You know, yeah, like you guys, you and I together, remember what we did? So Paul stands up and says, look, it's about my conscience. Now there's a lot of verses about conscience that we could go to. Romans 9:1, 1 Timothy 1:5, and verse 19. Acts 24:16, Titus 1:15, Hebrews 10:12, and Hebrews 9:14. I'm not going to go to those references right now. I think I'm going to cover those maybe later in either this chapter or the next. And we'll look at some places where Paul uses the word conscience. But we're supposed to have a good conscience. And a conscience is basically what God gives everybody when they're born in this world. And when they get to the age of understanding right from wrong. And when you do wrong, you have a conscience. And it pricks your conscience. It makes you feel bad. And you say, I know I shouldn't have done that. And everybody gets that. But the Bible tells us that you can sin against your conscience and sear your conscience with a hot iron. In the sense that you go to sinning so much and begin to enjoy sin so much that you literally don't feel bad for it anymore. You don't have a conscience. You can go out and do horrible things, kind of like Jeffrey Dahmer and people that become just horrible murderers. They don't even have a conscience. They kill people and eat their bodies and do serial killers. They've sinned so much they've seared their conscience. So it's always a good thing to have a good conscience before God. A good conscience sleeps in a thunderstorm, is the old saying. You know, if I've done wrong, but the whole world accuses me of doing evil, then I can rest at night because I know they're wrong and I haven't done anything. They're just lying about me. So he says he has a good conscience. Now, verse 2, and the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. So the first thing they do when Paul gets his chance to get before all of the priests, okay, the time before in Acts 22, he's before all the Jews. Now he's in front of the Jewish leaders. So Paul is standing here now in front of the Jewish leaders. And he's saying, okay, now I'm going to get to talk to the religious leaders of Israel, which probably wanted to do anyway. And there were two groups here with these leaders. There were the Pharisees and there were the Sadducees. And what we're going to find out is that there was something that divided them, that one group believed that the other didn't. So Paul comes before these religious leaders. This would be the high priest. This would probably be a bunch of the Levitical priests. And this would be many of the scribes. And Paul is before them. And Paul says, okay, I'm going to start talking to you. So he starts out, men and brethren, okay, my brothers in the flesh, because he's a Jew. I have lived in all conscience before God unto this day. And as he's about to continue speaking, the high priest says, punch him in the mouth. Or slap him in the mouth. Smite, you know. It could be slap him or it could be just, bow, shut up. Probably slap him in the mouth. So they let him speak one sentence. And then they go, shut up, bow, and hit him in the face. Do you see a little bit of bias there? You see a little bit of hatred? Do you see a little bit of somebody not wanting him to speak? Now the next thing we see here in verse 3 is Paul in the flesh. This is the Apostle Paul, the guy that tells us to walk in the Spirit, that we fulfill not the lust of the flesh. But Paul gets in the flesh. Now, before I get there, let me go back to verse 2. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Now, that means the high priest tortures Paul. He says, go ahead and hit him. Now, did they do anything like that to Jesus? Let's go back to Matthew chapter 26. When you start thinking about this high priest, you got to think, this guy is not a just ruler. This guy's a jerk. This guy is not only a religious hypocrite, but a guy that thinks it's okay to go around slapping people, torturing people, hitting people. What a jerk. And I hate to say that about the guy, but he was, according to the scriptures. Matthew chapter 26, here's Jesus before the high priest. Matthew 26, 65 through 68. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, he hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, he is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him. Buffet means to punch, to hit. And others smote him with the palm of their hands. So smote him with the palm of their hands. So when they're smiting Paul, it's probably a good chance that they went ahead and slapped him in the face. But they did the same thing to Jesus. They spit on Jesus, they punched him, and they slapped him in the face. So they're doing the same thing to Paul that they did to Jesus. That's bad. That's evil. That's wicked. They're not supposed to do that. And we're about to see that the Apostle Paul, when that happens, he gets in the flesh and he answers in the flesh. So imagine Paul. Paul's all, I've got the right gospel. Jesus told me what to preach. I came to these people. I want to see them saved. I want to tell them about the true blood, the blood atonement, because this blood doesn't save you anymore. It's all about the blood of Christ. And he stands up, men and brethren, I want to tell you that I've lived in good conscience before God until this day. Pow! They slap him in the face. And instead of him saying, oh, that's okay, I love you guys anyway, he says, you bunch of brother, and he goes off on them. He gets mad and he gets in the flesh. Look at verse 3. Then said Paul unto them, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. He's like, I'm of God. Slap, you're not of God. God will get you, you bunch of whited hypocrites. What a thing. So he speaks out in the flesh. Then said Paul unto them, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? Paul says, really? You're going to slap me? And you claim to be followers of the law of Moses, and you go against the law of Moses? You bunch of hypocrites! Who do you think you are? And it just comes out like that from the flesh. Oh, it's so easy to speak like that sometimes. Look at verse 4. And they stood by and said, revilest thou God's high priest? Really? You're going to talk back to the priest that's God's high priest? And Paul says, well, then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler. So Paul says, oh, all right, I'm sorry. He apologizes. So Paul immediately gets in the flesh. But let me ask you this. If you were in his place, if that was you right there, what would you have done? You know, Jesus says if somebody smites thee on the right cheek, you just give them the left cheek. You know, that's easier said than done sometimes. Sometimes somebody smacks us and we get in the flesh and we say something in anger we shouldn't. Paul is a better man than me. I probably would have punched him back. I'm sorry. But Paul says unto them, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. So what is a whited wall? What is Paul calling them when he calls them a whited wall? Well, a whited wall is a wall that has been painted over with whitewash. Why would you paint a wall? Why would you go to a wall and say, man, that wall needs to be painted. Let's get some white paint and paint it over. Make it look clean. Because it's dirty. You know, if you move into a house, usually the first thing you do if you buy a house is you paint the walls. Because the former tenants usually would get the walls dirty. Sometimes kids would, you know, use crayons on the wall or something. And so you paint a wall because the wall's dirty. So what is Paul saying? He's saying, you bunch of filthy, dirty people. You might look nice and white outwardly, but inside you're dirty because you're corrupt, because you're wrong, because you're murderers and liars and deceivers and devils. So he's basically saying that they're dirty people. They're hypocrites. They're trying to look good and clean on the outside, but inside Paul's saying, I know what you really are. You are corrupt, evil, wicked people, and your heart is dirty. That's what Paul is saying. So Paul lashes out in anger and speaks in the flesh and calls them a whited wall. He's basically calling them a hypocrite. Now, Jesus calls the Pharisees hypocrites. Why would Jesus say that? Because that's what they were. And their true colors come out more and more and more the more that we go through the book of Acts. The more that we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts, the more we see just how evil and wicked these Pharisees were. The old saying is, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, they've taken their position of power and they've corrupted it. And because of that, Jesus, when he showed up in his earthly ministry, he looked down on the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders because they were apostates. And they were deceivers and thieves and liars. And Jesus didn't like it. Let me show you some places where Jesus calls them hypocrites. Matthew chapter 6, verse 2. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Jesus says, those hypocrites, well, they want everybody to think that they're so good, so they blow a trumpet and say, come and listen to the Pharisees. We're going to give money now, and to be seen of men. Oh, look how great they are because they give away money. No, they're not great at all. Now look at verse 5. And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. They try to look so spiritual, these lost religious leaders. Oh, look at me praying, hallelujah. And people go, oh, aren't we so good? And aren't we so blessed to have them as our leaders? Look how they pray all the time. But inside they're a bunch of hypocrites. They're just doing it for show. They're not really caring about the people. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 16. This sounds like the whited wall comment that Paul makes. Verse 16, Jesus says, moreover, when you fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance. For they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. When you fast for a long time, you kind of become a little bit pale and a little bit white. And so what are they doing? It sounds like they're putting, white makeup on or something to try to make people think, wow, he's fasted a long time. Look how pasty and white he is. Why, he must have gone many, many days praying and fasting. No, he did that just to appear to look like he was spiritual when he's not. He's a hypocrite. Jesus did not like that. Matthew chapter 16, verse 2 through 4. All throughout Jesus' ministry, he's calling them a bunch of hypocrites. Why? Because they're dirty-hearted people that try to appear to look so clean and righteous on the outside, being something that they're not. They were not clean and they were not righteous. Matthew 16:2. Matthew 16:2, Jesus answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you say that it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites! Ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times? A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given it but unto the sign of Jonah, the prophet Jonas. And he left them and departed. Jesus said, you are a bunch of hypocrites, you lost religious leaders, and you're adulterers. Remember in was it Matthew 8? Or was it Mark 8? Well, wherever it was, or John 8. It was John 8. Whenever they came to Jesus with this woman taken in adultery. And they come to Jesus, these Pharisees, they say, we caught her in adultery, we caught her. Where was the man? Why didn't they catch the man in adultery? Why the woman? And Jesus says, yeah, well, he that has no sin, let him cast the first stone. Okay, go ahead, stone her. And they all walked away. Because Jesus knew they were a bunch of adulterers. They were religious leaders, but they fell into sin with harlots and whores, probably. Just like, religious leaders of today. A lot of times today you hear of this man that's a real big Christian preacher or something, and the next thing you know, he falls into sin with prostitutes. Why is that? Well, because number one, he's not saved. Number two, he's a hypocrite. He's trying to make himself look outwardly as a great preacher, but inwardly he's dirty and filthy and evil. Matthew 22:18. I just want to show you some verses where Jesus calls them hypocrites. Matthew 22:18. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt me, ye? Why tempt ye me, he says, ye hypocrites? Again, Jesus calls them hypocrites. Now, Matthew chapter 23, 7 times Jesus calls them hypocrites. 23:13. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer, therefore you shall receive the greater damnation. Jesus is saying, you guys are lost and going to hell, because you're religious hypocrites that are not interested in the things of God, but only interested in making yourself rich and stealing from widows and doing evil things. Verse 15, woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass sea and land to make one proselyte. When he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe unto you, you blind guides. Look at verse 23. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. He's saying, look, you don't have any mercy, you don't have any faith, you don't do judgment, you don't follow the law that God gave to them. You're hypocrites. You're liars. You're making yourself look like you are a religious leader on the outside who's clean and righteous, but inside you are evil. Look at verse 25. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Jesus is saying, you're trying to look clean and righteous outward, but I see your insides, and you're filthy. You're filthy hypocrites. Verse 29, or actually verse 27. This sounds like what Paul said when he called them the whited wall. Verse 27, Matthew 24. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones, and of all uncleanness. Paul says, you whited wall? What is he saying? He says, you bunch of Pharisees, you try to clean up the outside, but you're not interested in being clean on the inside. Now verse 29. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous. So 7 times Jesus calls them hypocrites in Matthew 23. So back to Acts 23, this is who Paul is dealing with. Paul would have studied with the early Christians after he got saved, would have read probably Matthew if it had been written at the time, I don't know. but he probably would have known that Jesus had a very low estimation. He thought very lowly of these people because he knew what they were really like. And they ended up killing Jesus because they were so evil. So the Apostle Paul says, you whited wall. So he gets slapped in the face by the high priest. And then in verse 3 he says, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for thou sittest to judge me after the law, and thou commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law. Now, what is he doing? Well, Paul says that I'm not the transgressor. I'm not the guy that broke the law. You guys broke the law by slapping me when you're not supposed to do that. And he's saying you guys are evil. And he says you're the ones that just broke the law. Now, why would he say that? Well, let's go to Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 3. The Old Testament law, if they knew it, and you got to wonder if these evil Pharisees and Sadducees even read the Bible, because Paul did, and he read it, and he says, man, I saw Jesus all through it. How come they didn't? Probably didn't even read it. But in Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 3, look at what it says is supposed to take place if the high priest and the priests, the rulers of the people, are judging someone. Deuteronomy 25, 1. If there be a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. Verse 2, and it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down and to be beaten before his face according to his fault by a certain number. Verse 3, 40 stripes he may give him and not exceed, lest if he should exceed and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee. So here is what's going on, and Paul says, look, you're supposed to justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. Here I am a righteous man, and you beat me? I've done no wrong. You guys are hypocrites. You don't beat a man unless he's guilty. And Paul says, I'm not guilty. So you guys are breaking the law. Go to Leviticus 19:35. So Paul knew his Bible. And he thought in his mind, I'm going to combat these people by quoting the law to them. And you got to wonder if they even knew the law, and they're supposed to be the religious leaders. Paul knew more than they did, probably. Leviticus 19:35, look what this says. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 35, ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, and on and on. So you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. And what do? They didn't even let Paul get to a second sentence of what he wanted to say, and they beat him. That's unjust. That's wrong. That's not judgment. You're supposed to hear someone out first and then declare them guilty or innocent. So they are going against the law. So verse 3 in Acts 23. Then Paul said unto them, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by says, revilest thou the high priest? Paul, what do you think you're doing? Who do you think you are to question God's priest? Well, the scriptures say he's not supposed to do that. It has to be the judges that condemn a man, not just one guy. So Paul says no. So verse 5, then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Here he quotes Exodus 22:28. So let's go back to Exodus 22:28. Paul says, okay, look, I'm still trying to show you that I'm a Jew and I believe in the Old Testament law. And if you'd let me speak, what I'm trying to get to is that the law leads us to Christ. And I want you to come to Christ. That's Paul's agenda. But he's trying to show them, look, I am one of you. I've come from where you come from. We have much in common. Let me finish. Smack. They wouldn't let him finish. Exodus 22:28. Thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of thy people. So under the Old Testament law, you're not supposed to curse the ruler, which would have been at that time the high priest. He would have been the main judge. So, back to verse 5. Then Paul said, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Verse 6. And when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, he cried out to the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, of the hope of the resurrection of the dead am I called in question. So Paul's looking at this and he's thinking to himself, I'm in a bad situation. I disobeyed God and came to Jerusalem when I shouldn't have. Now I've been caught, I've been found out, they're beating me. Well, if they keep hitting me, they'll probably kill me like they killed Jesus. So I got to figure something out. What do? I'm trying to be respectful. I'm quoting the law. I didn't realize, that the high priest was the guy that said to smack me. I'm not supposed to. What do I do? And then Paul says, now wait a minute. There's two people here. There's the group of the Pharisees. There's a group of the Sadducees. And Paul thinks to himself, what can I do? Divide and conquer. What I'll do is I'll take a side and I'll say, look, I'm with these people. I'm a Pharisee. And that way, then there'll only be half of the group that's mad at me and not the whole group. And then Paul will say, I'm one of you guys. Really, the problem is those guys over there. So he's trying to divert. And that's a tactic. Does it work? Well, maybe for a little bit, but we're going to find out it doesn't work ultimately. So Paul says, look, I was going to tell you all that I am a Pharisee. I'm not one of the Sadducees. It says, so I am a Pharisee, and he says, for the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. So Paul says what this whole thing is about, if you really want to know, is about resurrection. And I think in Paul's mind, what he wants to do is he wants to tell them about the resurrection of Christ. Because the gospel is how that Christ died for our sins, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day. So I think Paul is going to say, all right, I'm trying to keep this about Jesus, so I'm going to start telling about how Jesus was resurrected, or how Jesus rose again. And then I think he's going to say, at least I can get that much of the gospel in. Because the gospel is how that Christ died for our sins, was buried, and rose again the third day, according to Scripture. So he says, I'm going to make this about the resurrection. And there's a reason why he brings up the resurrection. Let's continue reading and you'll see why. Verse 7, and when he had said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. He splits them over a doctrinal issue. Why was there a division? Verse 8, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. So here we have an amazing thing in the Scriptures. We have a historical record that tells us about the two main religious leading groups in Israel and some of the differences between them. The Pharisees believed that there was a resurrection of the dead. There were angels. There were spirits, which a man has a spirit, but there's also disemboweled spirits. There's demons. There's things like that. And the Pharisee says, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees said, we don't believe that. Now, why didn't they believe it? When in the Bible itself, the Old Testament law, talked about it. So here's the problem that we come into. There is a resurrection of the dead. Now, I thought I had written this down. I guess I have it later, a little later on. Maybe it might be next time, to show you some places in the Old Testament. Well, let me just show you, and if I've got it in my notes for another time, I'll show you. But the Old Testament law talks about the resurrection of the dead. Let's go to Daniel. I'm going by memory right now. Daniel 12. One of the scriptures of the Old Testament talks about the resurrection is in Daniel chapter 12. I believe it's verse 1 and 2. Let me see if that's right. Yes. Actually, verse 2. Daniel 12:2 says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting shame and contempt. There will be a time when there will be people that are dead in the graves rising from the dead. That is called a resurrection of the dead. I believe it's in John, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Believest thou this? And I can't remember if it was Mary or Martha that Jesus was talking to. I think it was Mary. And she says, yes, Lord, I believe there will be a resurrection someday of all the dead. So they believed in the resurrection of the dead because the Scriptures, the Old Testament, the law, said it. So what does that mean the Sadducees were? They did not believe in the law. They would not believe the Scriptures. So they were a pretty bad group. They refused to believe what the Bible actually said. So, verse 7, the Pharisees and the Sadducees began fighting amongst themselves. And that got a little bit of the hatred toward Paul off of him for a minute. Now he had them fighting amongst themselves. And I don't know, but I just picture Paul. When he says that, the Pharisees and the Sadducees start going at it with each other. And Paul kind of just smiles a little bit. Oh, so predictable. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there, but I can just imagine Paul kind of goes, yeah, they hate each other. They fight each other. Now they're both together agreeing to hate me. Let me just remind each other why they hate one another and see what happens. And then they forget Paul for a second and start fighting each other. He kind of went, Yeah, too easy, too easy. But anyway, I don't know. He may have, he may not have. But that's just how I like to think that he might have done. So they were divided over this issue. Now verse 9. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. So the Pharisees get up and say, well, you know what? He's one of us. Let's just forget it and walk out. So the Pharisees were about to let it go, but the Sadducees were like, no, we're not here to fight each other. It's this guy. He's the problem. So they were going to let it go. But the Sadducees, the unbelievers in the Scriptures, because if they were true believers in what the Bible said, they would believe in the resurrection because the resurrection is in the Bible. So verse 10 says, And when there arose a great dissension. There was a great dissension. This is one of the greatest doctrinal differences between these two groups. And Paul brought it up just to see what would happen. And it almost got him off. But there became a great dissension. The chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and to take him by force from among them and to bring him in the castle. So they're fighting Paul. Then Paul's got them fighting against themselves. And then finally, these people, their anger goes back to Paul. And there's a great dissension that arises. And the Roman guard who was there was feared that they were going to take Paul and pull him in pieces. They're going to just rip him apart. So he commanded the soldiers, he said, go get him. Take him by force from among them and bring him into the castle. So they went down by force. Now they're probably pushing Jews off of him. And just doing all they can to push these Jews off. And they grab Paul and they bring him out. Now verse 11. In the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. So God appears to Paul, and he says, Paul, I told you not to go to Jerusalem, but you did. Look at what happened. But he says, but Paul, good job. Even though you did what I didn't want you to do, you stood up for me. He said, you're going to make it to Rome, Paul. It says, when you do, you testified of me here. He says, I want you to testify of me there. So Paul is to testify of Jesus wherever he goes. And he tried there in Jerusalem, and they would have nothing of it. And so God says, now you're going to Rome. And so he ends up going to Rome. Now, verse 12 through 14 is interesting and one of my favorite parts of the book of Acts. Because these guys make up in their mind an oath that they're going to swear. And they're going to swear an oath that they will not eat until they kill Paul. And as you continue reading the book of Acts, these guys aren't mentioned much anymore. But guess what they never do? They never kill Paul. So I wonder if they really followed through with their oath that they swore to God, and if they really did die of starvation. But let me read it here, verse 12. And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now let me ask you that. Is that lawful? Is that right? No, that's conspiracy. There are true conspiracy. Today, the word conspiracy almost is synonymous with fake. People today talk about, oh, conspiracy theory. There's no such thing as conspiracy. Now, there's a lot of conspiracies in the Bible. And there's still law in the books that you can go to jail for a conspiracy, for conspiring together against someone. So these people come together and they say, we bind ourselves under a curse. We make an oath to God that He'd kill us unless we kill Paul. Verse 13, and they were more than 40 which made this conspiracy. So 40 men came along and said, we're going to kill Paul. And these 40 men said, we're going to do everything we can to kill this guy. And we will not eat until he's dead. All right? They said their curse was they would not eat until they had slain Paul. Verse 15. Now therefore, ye with the council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though he would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him. So these 40 guys go to the chief priest and say, look, we want to kill Paul. Go to the Romans and tell the Romans, well, we just want to question Paul one more time. There's one more question we have. Bring him tomorrow and let us ask him one more time. We promise we won't fight this time. No, just let us talk to him one more time. And when he comes down to talk to him one more time, these 40 guys says, we're going to be all around. And we're going to come out and we're going to kill him like they killed Caesar. You know what they do? Stab Caesar to death 30-something times or something? I guess that was their plan, to stab Paul to death. Now, verse 16. And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Now, Paul's sister's son would be Paul's nephew. So we understand from this verse that Paul had family in Jerusalem. Was that why Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem, to visit his family? His sister and her family? Could be. I don't know. That might have been one of the reasons why Paul went there. And while he was going to visit family, why he wanted to try to witness to the Jews and everything. But God told him don't do it. But he did. And this is how it all turned out. And so God says, okay, you testified of me. Good job. Now when you end up in Rome, Paul, I want you to do the same thing. Witness. Testify. Tell people. So Paul's sister was there among the Jews, and she heard it. She heard the plot, the conspiracy of these 40 men, and she went and told Paul. Verse 17, then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, bring this young man unto the chief captain. So this is Paul's nephew. He says, take my nephew here to the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him. Verse 18, so he took him and brought him to the chief captain, and said, Paul the prisoner called me unto him, and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee. Verse 19, then the chief captain took him by the hand, and went with him aside privately, and asked him, what is it that thou hast to tell me? Now remember, this is a Roman who speaks Greek. He doesn't understand Hebrew. So this shows me that all the Hebrews spoke Hebrew and Greek. And that this young nephew of Paul, he's probably speaking to the guy in Greek. So the Jews would have known Greek and Hebrew. But part of their religion, part of their identity, was to make sure they always protected the Jewish language, because that was their heritage, that was their language. But they would have learned Greek because Greek was the language of the entire world, because the Roman Emperor took over. So he's probably speaking to him in Greek. So he says, what is that thou hast to tell me? Verse 20, he said, the Jews have agreed to desire thee, that thou would bring down Paul tomorrow unto the council, as though they would inquire something of him more perfectly. But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath, that they would neither eat, nor drink, till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from thee. So Paul's nephew comes to that Roman and says, these guys want to kill Paul. Please don't send him to his death, because they took an oath before God that they're going to kill him. So what happens? Well, verse 22. So the chief captain then let the young man depart, and charged him, see thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me. So these guys in secret thought they were conspiring, but the truth came out. And the truth always comes out. That's why I would never want to be a part of a conspiracy, because the truth is going to come out. You can't keep a secret. You know, the pirates said, dead men tell no tales. The pirates, they would come together and do bad things, and then they go and kill everybody else so that nobody could tell that they did it. That was awful. I wouldn't want to be a pirate. So the truth comes out that they are trying to kill Paul. Now verse 23, and he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, and at the 3rd hour of the night. So here we have, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea. So 200 soldiers, and horsemen 70. All right, that'd be 70 people on horse, and spearmen 200. So 200 spearmen, 200 soldiers, and 70 cavalry. That's 470 men. He says, take with you 470 men, and use those 470 men around Paul to protect him, to get him out of the city. Now, how on earth would those 40 men have defeated 470 men? They would have had to kill 11. Each one of them would have had to kill 11 Romans in order to kill Paul. There's no way they were going to do it. So he is going overboard to make sure Paul is safe. And he says, take Paul to Caesarea. All right? Caesarea is up here. This is the city of Caesarea. There's another city right here, which is the city of Antipatris, where they end up going. So Paul has gotten out of Jerusalem, and he's taken here and then here. So they get Paul out away to safety. Now, why are the Romans helping Paul? Because Paul said he was a Roman citizen, and he is. And a Roman citizen is supposed to have a fair trial. And it was obvious that the Jews are not going to give him a fair trial. They want to kill him. Verse 23, and he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, and the 3rd hour of the night. Provide them beasts, that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. So Paul is given a horse, or a donkey, a mule, and he is given it, and he's going. And he wrote a letter after this manner. Now, verse 26 down to verse 30 is the letter written by this man, Claudius Lysias, unto the governor Felix. And here's what it says. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. Now, when we write a letter today, we do it opposite of the way it was done in the old days. We say, Dear brother so-and-so, yada yada, and at the end we say, we love you, and sincerely, and then our name. But in the old days, the person that was writing the letter, his name was given first. So at least you know who's writing to you, and then you know what they're saying. So I always found that interesting. So Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I received to be accused of questions of their law, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. Okay, so he says, look, I don't want to deal with this. I'm sending him to you. And what he did is he sent him to the governor of Judea. And so all of this is Judea, okay? All of this is the province of Judea. So he says, I'm going to take you from the city and then send you to the state, if you will, or the province. And so Paul was sent to Felix. Now verse 31, Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. I wrote it wrong there. Antipatris. How do you spell this? Antipatris. Well, I spelled it right. The way you pronounce it. Is it Antipatris or is it Antipatris? However you pronounce it, that's where he sent him. On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle. So overnight, they got him out of the city, and they got him out overnight. Through the night, they took him up here to this place. Then the soldiers went back. And Paul was kept safe, probably in a jail or in a castle or something. Now verse 33, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. So from there, he ends up to Caesarea. Now verse 34, and when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, then what? Verse 35, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. Now, this guy is asking Paul, oh, so you're a Roman. What province are you from? Well, this up here was a province of Cilicia. And in Cilicia was the city of Tarsus that Paul was born in. So Paul says, look, I'm a Roman and I'm from Cilicia. And so this guy goes, oh, okay, so you're from that province. Okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you in Herod's judgment hall. We're going to leave you in this place and wait your trial and see how it goes from there. And that's what they did. Now we get to chapter 24, and we'll look at that next time. And here's what happens. The Jews come again to talk to Paul. This time they bring a lawyer with them. And this time they try to accuse Paul of certain things. And again, Paul goes to this right here. And he says this whole thing is a question of whether or not you believe in the resurrection. Now, what does the entire book of Acts start out with? The entire book of Acts is what I've told you before, is about the who and the what. So whenever they start out the book of Acts, it's only talking about who Jesus is. Later with Paul, we get the message of trusting in what Jesus did. So all the book of Acts is all about Jesus, who he was and what he did. And the resurrection proves that Jesus was the Messiah. He's God manifest in the flesh. So the fact that Jesus rose from the dead proves that Jesus is Messiah, God manifest in the flesh. And the reason that Jesus resurrected was to offer his blood on the mercy seat in heaven. And that's what the book of Hebrews is about. How Jesus was the Messiah. And then, is it chapter 8? We have to go through that book again. That when Jesus rose again, he went up to heaven and placed his blood on the altar in heaven, because there's a tabernacle in heaven. And Moses' tabernacle was patterned after that. So I clearly see that this resurrection thing that Paul's talking about is to point them to who Jesus is, that they might believe that Jesus was their true Messiah, and what Jesus did. Trust the blood atonement. So all through the book of Acts, Paul's message is all about being justified by faith in the blood. And I continue to see him talking about the blood of Christ. So there it is. There's Acts chapter 24. I hope that has been a blessing to you. And we'll see you next time as we continue with Acts chapter 24.